Roald Amundsen was one of the greatest polar explorers in history. In 1911, he won the race to the South Pole, famously beating a much larger expedition led by Britain's Robert Scott. Amundsen succeeded thanks to vital lessons he'd learned 8 years earlier during his first great adventure, a voyage through the Northwest Passage. This ice-choked waterway across the Canadian Arctic had defeated every previous attempt to sail through it, killing many brave explorers over the centuries. Then in 1903, Amundsen devised a novel approach and set out to beat the passage once and for all. He led his men into uncharted waters, braved the cruel Arctic winter, and forged a powerful bond with the native Inuit, who helped him become a master of ice and snow. Starboard! How was this maverick explorer, with only a handful of companions and a modest fishing boat, able to achieve what so many others had failed to do for 400 years? What was the secret behind the record-breaking journey that started it all? Arctic Passage, Ice Survivor, right now on Nova. On a summer night in 1903, a small fishing boat slipped unnoticed out of Oslo harbor. The man at the helm, a 30-year-old Norwegian named Roald Amundsen. He'd set out in search of the fabled Northwest Passage, a long-sought route to the Pacific Ocean that winds through the Canadian Arctic. The passage was infamous as one of the most perilous waterways in the world. No ship had ever made it all the way through its frozen maze of ice, and many had lost their lives trying. Yet this lone pioneer believed that he could succeed where the mightiest navies of the world had failed time and again. To many, the voyage seemed suicidal. But for Amundsen, this was the fulfillment of a dream that had gripped him since childhood. As a boy, he'd been drawn to stories of fearless men who pitted themselves against the harsh Arctic wilderness. The hero he most revered was Sir John Franklin, the 19th century British explorer, famous for his courage in the face of adversity. Franklin had made several failed attempts to sail the passage. Each time, he and his men grappled with starvation and other hardships. On his third attempt, his ships became locked in the ice. He and 128 crewmen all died. Franklin's harrowing experiences didn't dissuade Amundsen. Rather, they inspired in him a desire to test himself in the harsh Arctic.
Strangely, it was the suffering that Sir John and his men experienced that appealed to me most.
Yes, he was all gone. I guess a heart attack.
In his day, the Northwest Passage was the great unknown, with its ever-shifting ice pack. Today, it remains treacherous and is kept under constant surveillance, tracked by satellite and by reconnaissance aircraft. The data they collect is a vital lifeline for navigators, who must thread their way through an ice maze that is constantly shifting with the wind and currents.
We provide a daily chart of where the ice is and where we think it's going to go. Every day, a ship will get a warning of what kind of dangerous conditions are there. We regularly issue ice warnings due to pressure or ice warning due to rapid closing of leads. ships get stuck, ships get stopped. 75,000 horsepower icebreakers get stuck in the ice. That's the difficulty of Arctic navigation. It's knowing where the ice, the shifting maze, matrix of ice, is going to be at the time when I want to get my ship through.
The ice had defeated every previous expedition, but in his tiny ship, Amundsen was determined to conquer it.
He wanted to be a hero who sacrificed something to explore these extremely difficult parts of the world.
The youngest of 4 boys, Amundsen was born in Oslo in 1872. When he was only 14, his father, a shipowner, died suddenly. As a consequence, Roald became the focus of his mother's ambitions. She decided he would stay out of the family maritime business and become a doctor instead. He bowed to her wishes, but in his heart he wanted a different future for himself, a dream he pursued in secret.
Amundsen was a man who very early learned to hide his ambitions. And I think his own mother was the first one he betrayed.
He spent much of his free time at the city library. While his mother may well have thought he was studying medicine, he was actually dissecting accounts of failed expeditions to the Passage, preparing for the day when he would become an explorer in his own right. His studies convinced him that previous expeditions had all suffered from the same flaw. They'd relied on big ships built to bully their way through the ice. And the more he read of the disastrous Franklin expedition, the more he became convinced that this brute force method could never succeed. And he burned for the chance to prove that there was a better way. Then, in 1888, 27-year-old Fridtjof Nansen, a fellow Norwegian, became a national hero when he and a handful of companions crossed Greenland on skis. Nansen's systematic approach was a radical departure in polar exploration. With specially designed equipment, he traveled light and relied on skis to move as quickly as possible.
Gone was the old idea of the siege, where you took your world with you and set about defeating the place. Instead, Nansen had the approach of a modern mountaineer. You hone your techniques to absolute perfection, you master your environment as well as you can, but above all, you remain flexible, both physically but also mentally.
Amundsen greatly admired Nansen and wanted to follow his example.
Every day my interest grew. Night and day I dreamt of being out in the polar snow and ice.
But his family obligations prevented him from fulfilling his dream, and it seemed that he might never get his chance to prove himself. Then, when he was 21, Amundsen's mother died, releasing him from the sense of duty that had held him back. He first began the arduous process of training to become a ship's captain. He spent 3 years working as a sailor, followed by 2 years as a mate to earn the right to command his own vessel. And he didn't stop there. He also immersed himself in the science of magnetism, hoping to settle a debate about whether the magnetic pole was fixed or shifted over time.
So for the past centuries, navigators have found their way by using magnetic fields. The magnetic field.
Doubting that he would be able to raise money simply for a trip through the Passage, he told backers that his voyage would resolve the controversy once and for all. Meanwhile, he took many cross-country excursions into the mountains of Norway. Following in Nansen's footsteps, he was hoping to improve his stamina on skis. One time, on a trip with his brother, he learned firsthand just how unforgiving the icy north can be.
We had a northwest storm upon us. The only correct thing would have been to turn around, but our ski tracks were already drifted over and the weather surrounded us on all sides.
With blizzard conditions closing in, they became desperate for shelter. Amundsen and his brother dug snow caves where they spent a cold, uncomfortable night.
When the first daylight came, he discovered I was frozen in. The snow had been wet when it fell and had frozen into a compact mass around me. Only after frantic digging was he able to set me free.
While buried in the snow, he nearly suffocated and almost lost several fingers to frostbite. But he learned how dangerous and unpredictable the icy wilderness could be, and he became more determined than ever to master it.
In the young Amundsen, in a way you see the classic young explorer. He's pitting himself against the world in this dangerously self-centered way. He sees almost a romance in the pain he's going to experience.
Amundsen's forays into the mountains strengthened his resolve to challenge the Arctic. Eventually, he managed to borrow enough money to buy supplies and to purchase a sturdy, square-sterned, 29-year-old herring boat called the Joa. It was tiny compared to the ships the British had deployed into the passage, but that was all part of Amundsen's plan.
What has not been accomplished with large vessels and brute force, I will attempt with a small vessel and patience.
He knew he was going into uncharted waters, and the smaller the ship, the easier it is to handle. So when he was searching for a vessel, he wanted something which he knew was strong enough to withstand considerable ice pressure, but at the same time so small that a small crew would be able to handle this vessel.
To learn how to manage his small boat in the ice, he studied with fishermen and others habituated to Arctic waters.
He was looking for people who had an experience coping with ships and with ice, to familiarize with the nature, the landscape, the weather, everything up there.
Amundsen recruited a 6-man team of Arctic experts to help him sail his converted fishing boat. But after 8 years of preparation, he was deeply in debt. His creditors threatened to seize the Joa. At the 11th hour, his second cousin came through with the money. And on June 16, 1903, Amundsen and his men quietly sailed out of Oslo harbor under the light of the midnight sun. The smallest and most daring assault on the Northwest Passage was on its way. That morning in his cabin, he wrote,
It was glorious. No anxiety, no troublesome creditors, no tedious people with foolish prophecies or sneers. The world seemed again to be full of spirit and delight.
Amundsen's confidence was that of a man used to relying on his own sources. Entering the Arctic, he had nothing but a compass, a sextant, and a half-map chart. He had no radio, no means of calling for help. Only the combined instincts and experience of 7 men trying to outwit the ice.
This was a group of people who realized that these environments were too big, too great, too strong to defeat. You had to use them. You had to almost do a dance with these elements. And this new form of exploration is not without risks because you're very vulnerable.
The Joa's journey into the ice maze brought them first to Beechey Island. This was the site where Amundsen's boyhood hero, Sir John Franklin, and his men spent their first winter, back in 1845. For Amundsen, being there was an extraordinary experience, a chance to tread in the footsteps of the most famous and catastrophic polar expedition in history.
He always paid his historic debts. When he came to Beechey Island, he says that he sat out meditating about these people who had paid with their lives. And that's why he always used to say he was not going to accomplish the Northwest Passage. He was going to complete the Northwest Passage, which had been pioneered by other people before him.
I had the feeling I was on holy ground. I pictured the expedition in all its splendor. The English colors flying, the officers in dazzling uniforms, Sir John's clever face full of character and gentleness.
1890.
He had a word for everyone and was loved by his men. But now sadness hangs over the island. From this point, the expedition passed into darkness and death.
After the famous British expedition disappeared, the Royal Navy dispatched dozens of search parties throughout the 1850s. Their cartographers filled in many of the blank areas on their maps, giving Amundsen an advantage that Franklin never had. From Beechey Island, the charts offered Amundsen several possible routes. But his own research had convinced him that the key to the passage lay to the south through a notoriously icy channel called Peel Sound. Amundsen knew that Franklin had become locked in the ice at the end of Peel Sound, on the coast of King William Island. But the Norwegian believed that he could avoid that fate. He was betting that his fishing boat, so much smaller and lighter than Franklin's massive ships, would allow him to slip through the ice without getting stuck.
A small ship can not only squeeze between narrower leads between ice floes, but can also go in shallower areas, often where the ice recedes away from the coastline because of the heat generated by the shore. There'll be a narrow lead of open water, very shallow, very treacherous, but a shallow draft ship like Amundsen had is much more likely to get through that kind of an environment than the big ships of Franklin's era.
And another reason to turn into Peel Sound? His instruments told him the magnetic North Pole lay in that direction. So he steered his ship south into waters where some of the worst pack ice in the passage was known to collect. For the first 350 miles, the journey passed uneventfully. But then Amundsen faced a difficult choice. At the northern tip of King William Island, two routes lay before him. When Franklin reached this point, he had veered to the west, blundering right into the path of pack ice flowing down from the north. Ice that trapped his ships. But Amundsen knew something that Franklin didn't. There was another way around the island, a narrow channel to the east, discovered in the 1850s during the search for Franklin. Amundsen didn't know if this route was open. The men who had found it had passed on a warning. The channel appeared to be very narrow and exceedingly shallow.
The waters that Amundsen was planning to sail into had never been charted, of course. They knew where the coastlines were, they knew where the islands were, but they didn't know where the rocks were, the submerged rocks. So sailing a ship into that is every mariner's nightmare. The only thing that's worse than hitting ice in a ship is hitting rocks on the bottom. And if the ice can drive you against those rocks, that's a nightmare scenario.
Now, as the Gjoa crept forward through the ice, the ship's compass grew erratic. It was an encouraging sign that they were closing in on the magnetic pole, but it also meant that they were now sailing blind.
The compass, which had gradually been losing its capacity for self-adjustment, was now useless. We were steering by the stars, like the Vikings.
For 5 weeks, Amundsen and his men had been sailing through this Arctic labyrinth of ice and islands. Their search for the Northwest Passage was now taking them into uncharted waters. Then one night after dinner, an alarming incident occurred.
I was writing in my journal when I heard something that chilled me to the bone.
Fire! Fire! Fire!
In a moment, all hands were on deck.
It's safe. It's safe. It's safe. I'm sorry. It was my fault.
What about the oil?
A fire had broken out in the engine room, right among tanks holding 2,000 gallons of petrol. We all knew what would happen if the tanks got heated. The Joa and everything on board would be blown to atoms like an exploded bomb.
I'm sorry.
The fire was out before it caught, but it served to remind the men of how far they were from help of any kind. It was now September, just 3 months into the voyage. The Joa had traveled a remarkable 600 miles, nearly half the length of the passage. But weather conditions were deteriorating. The Joa was still within the dangerously narrow channel when 3 days after the fire, the first winter storm swept in. Then Amundsen heard the sound he feared most. The Joa had run aground, and her hull was splintering on the rocks. In storm force winds, it was safer to ride out the battering with the sails furled. But Amundsen gave an order that must have seemed foolhardy.
Ready?
Raise the canvas.
Right, bring up the main!
He risked losing the mast and the rigging in a desperate effort to use the gale winds to blow the Joa off the rocks.
Wind came in gusts howling through the rigging. Then we started a method of sailing that none of us is ever likely to forget. The sleet and spray washed over the vessel. The mast trembled, yet one thump, worse than ever, and we slid off.
It's working!
He had taken an almost suicidal risk with his ship, but he never doubted that it was the only way to save her. His decisiveness reinforced his authority as the unchallenged captain of the expedition.
He is as stubborn and fanatical as any of his rivals. You have to be his kind of polar explorer because he wants to do, in cold, sober fact, what other people are quite content to dream about.
They survived with the Joa intact, but time was running out. There were signs that within weeks the water would be frozen solid. It was time to find a winter harbor. On the south end of King William Island, they found a sheltered bay where the Joa could be safely frozen in. They christened their new home Joahaven. Today there is a small settlement here, home to more than 1,000 Inuit. They live in modern houses and are linked to Canada by a daily supply plane. But in some ways, these people continue to live life according to ancient traditions.
For thousands of years we survived here. We are the igloo society people. You have to be able to know how to hunt and survive from the animals that you hunt here. You have to know the animal movement, the migration route of the caribou. You have to live with the seasons to know the dangers of the land as an Inuit.
Amundsen made camp with the idea that he would try to learn to live off the land like the locals do. He had read accounts from Inuit who had tried in vain to help some of Franklin's stranded men some 50 years before. The Inuit reported that the British sailors lacked basic survival skills. But even if they had been able to fend for themselves, with 129 men, there were simply too many mouths to feed. The Inuit rarely traveled in groups of more than 20, because that was all this landscape could support. 3 days after his arrival, Amundsen encountered Inuit hunters for the first time. They were members of the Netsilik, a people with very little history of contact with European travelers. Armed with a gun and 2 words of greeting, he approached.
When they were 200 yards away, they halted. Then there flashed through my mind, heated with the excitement of warfare, the word Tamar, and I shouted it at the top of my voice.
Tamar! Tamar! Tamar!
In a moment, we flung away our rifle and hastened towards them, embracing and patting each other. It was hard to say on which side the joy was greater.
Eventually, Amundsen returned with the Inuit to their camp.
When we came within sight of the village, the Eskimos began to shout. I could catch only one word, Kabluna, white man. It was a strange scene. I shall never forget it. Out in the desolate snow landscape, I was surrounded by a crowd of savages, staring into my face and grabbing at my clothes. I was suddenly brought face to face with a people from the Stone Age, who as yet knew no other method of making fire than rubbing 2 pieces of wood together. We came here with all our ingenious inventions and firearms to people who still used lances and bows and arrows. But their tools, apparently so primitive, were as well adapted to their conditions as experience and the test of many centuries could have made them.
In the Victorian age, there was no use talking to the Eskimo. That didn't make you a great explorer. The Victorians wanted to prove that they were better than everyone else, that they had values to export. Perhaps it was a little bit ignoble to learn from people who ate their meat raw. In Amundsen, there was a totally different mentality. He saw the local people as people who offered the solution to that world. They belong to that landscape. There's no point in fighting it. It provides them with their food, their shelter, their medicine. It's all about seeing the place simply as a home, simply as a place that offers you everything.
That night, Amundsen slept inside an igloo. The Inuit beside him were naked, covered only by animal skins. Outside, it was -10. But inside they were comfortable. It was his first lesson in the Inuit art of survival, but not his last. After that experience, he threw himself wholeheartedly into the Inuit lifestyle. Amundsen began to dress in furs as his hosts did, and he encouraged his men to do so as well. And in doing so, he learned something vitally important. When he sweated in his old woolen clothes, they'd freeze as hard as board.
Warm.
But in loose, light skins with fur, he found he was warm and hardly sweated at all.
Thank you. Thank you.
On one of the coldest places on Earth, he remained warm and dry, wearing only animal skins and fur undergarments. It's a feat that no man-made fabric can quite match.
Even today, we still don't have the technology to simulate the same insulation with the same weight. This is nature that we are not able to surpass.
Scientists working for the Canadian military wanted to understand the thermal properties of animal skins. Experimenting in a climate chamber, they hoped to understand how the Inuit are able to protect themselves so effectively against extreme cold. Researchers discovered that the Inuits' preferred material, caribou fur, is anything but an accidental choice.
The secret of the caribou skin or any skin clothing is trapping air in an effective manner.
Air is nature's best insulator. The loose fit of animal skins traps air very effectively. But further examination reveals just why the fur is so effective. Each strand of hair is hollow, filled with air. yet remains super resilient because of its tough, honeycomb-like structure.
The density of the fur is such that it traps air very effectively. Even if you apply some pressure to it, it will retain its characteristic and its insulation.
The Inuit prefer caribou fur over seal or bear because it is lightweight and has excellent thermal properties.
The genius part of it is they were able to find the animal with the best fur characteristics.
In his quest to adopt the Inuit lifestyle, Amundsen didn't limit himself to wearing furs. He yearned to unlock all the Inuit survival secrets.
We set about learning the art of snow hut building. Taking hold of a monster knife with both hands, we cut the ice blocks. The snow must not be too brittle, as all the blocks will crumble. The hut is built in a spiral like a beehive, so that one layer rests on the previous one and extends a little further forward. Many a snow block did I get on my head when I tried this work.
Snow is full of air. So if you cut blocks of snow and pile them and make a house, it provides the best insulation against the environment. It can be minus 50 degrees Celsius outside, minus 60 degrees Celsius outside. Inside it's going to be about minus 5. Amazing.
As the long months of winter passed, the Inuits' lessons in Arctic living grew more intricate.
Seal hunting begins sometime in February, when the snow falls heavily and the seal cannot hear the steps of the huntsman. They find the seal's breathing holes out on the ice, but to detect the seal, they must use an ingenious device. They take a bunch of swans down and attach a single thread to a hook with 2 claws. Then they lean forward, keeping their eyes riveted to the hole. As soon as the seal comes within yards of the hole, the movement of the water sets the swans down in motion. That is the signal.
The Inuit were teaching Amundsen to respect the Arctic as they did. Within the frozen landscape that had destroyed the Franklin expedition, Amundsen now saw a hidden world, sometimes teeming with life.
In the spring, there are fat salmon and reindeer. In the autumn, unlimited cod. And yet in this Arctic Eden, those brave travelers died of hunger. They must have stopped here and seen for miles before them the snow-covered land and no sign of life. There's not another place in the world so abandoned and bare as this in winter.
As fruitful as Amundsen's studies with the Inuit were proving, his crew began to feel that he was taking things too far. That his fascination with these indigenous people was distracting him from the true purpose of the voyage.
The ice is clearing.
So in the spring of 1904, when the first signs of a thaw appeared in the bay, the men were anxious to be on their way. But Amundsen had other plans.
Should be able to move on in a couple of weeks, maybe a week if we're lucky.
We're not finished here.
He realized the skills he was learning would give him an expertise in polar survival unmatched by other explorers.
Need to stay on.
Becoming a master of ice and snow had turned into an obsession.
The crew didn't really understand what was going on with Amundsen. He likes more to go with the Eskimos. And then he's forgetting his crew and have no interest in his work. He wanted to fight against hunger, coldness, to show his greatness as a man. It's a landscape of death in a way, and he wanted to win over the death.
One reason Amundsen wanted to stay for another year among the Inuit was to master a skill that had so far eluded him: how to use Inuit sled dogs, the only efficient way for hunters to cover long distances on the ice.
He realizes what the key to exploration for him is going to be, and it's all going to be to do with energy. With these dogs, he could now pass quickly through the landscape. He could get away with so much more. He could choose his time, choose his moment, and pass through the landscape that much more effectively.
During the bitterly cold weeks of the previous March, Amundsen had set out on a 90-mile trip to reach the magnetic North Pole. He intended to use sled dogs as his means of transport, but he quickly learned that mastering the dogs and sled was far from easy, especially in temperatures that plunged to -60. The experiment soon came to grief.
The first hour, when we were all fresh, things went very well. But then the difficulties began. It seems as though we were driving the sledge through the sand of the desert. Every little snowdrift meant we had to stop. The poor dogs suffered greatly.
For 3 days, Amundsen pressed on, locked in a battle with the terrain. Only when the dogs could go no further did he finally admit defeat, dumping half his supplies in the snow and turning for home.
I now saw there was little to be gained by going on in this way and decided to turn back. The dogs soon saw which way we were going, and we men were all glad we had given up our hopeless task. With the sledge lighter, we did the journey that had taken us 2.5 days in just 4 hours.
The Inuit elders, amused at Amundsen's disastrous journey, let him in on the secret of the Inuits' ability to glide over snow in all conditions. Coat the runners of the sled with frozen moss and water. Then, with water warmed in the mouth, apply fine new layers of ice using a bearskin mitt, creating a surface that could run across any snow in the world. As their second winter wore on, it became clear that Amundsen's time in the Arctic was not only changing his life in profound ways, but the lives of the Inuit as well. He learned that some of his men had bartered with the Inuit for their wives. He reacted by banning the relationships. Gustav Wick wrote in his journal,
"The boss's mood is as sharp as a razor these days. He walks about sulking like a little child and meddles in things he preferably should stay away from. And from now on we can expect the most peculiar plans and heaven knows what else."
Amundsen discovered that there was congenital syphilis amongst some of the Inuit, which showed, of course, that they must have been in contact with Europeans. And there were other tensions. He believed that a polar expedition should be absolutely sexless. The whole concept of women ought to be banished.
Amundsen was an increasingly isolated figure. But while he may not have inspired much affection from his men, he had kept them alive and they were succeeding in their quest.
In the beginning, he needs people. He needs support. But later on, he's more and more selfish. He don't need them anymore. So he becomes more and more lonely.
Amundsen's relationship with the Inuit was also growing more complicated. By now, more than 60 families had joined the camp beside the Joa. It was more than the land could support. There were so many mouths to feed that Amundsen feared a raid on the ship's stores if Inuit hunters ever returned empty-handed.
There was a great number of them collected about us. We had to teach them to regard us with the greatest respect. I spoke to them about the white man's power, that we could spread destruction around us, and even at a great distance, accomplish the most extraordinary things. It was for them to behave properly and not to expose themselves to our terrible anger.
He became a kind of a king in his crew, of course, but also with the Inuits. He made the laws. He could kill a man if necessary. He was a master, the big chief, the king.
Amundsen had come in search of the Northwest Passage, but in delaying to learn the secrets of the Inuit, he'd brought his 20th century world to the Arctic and set in motion changes that could never be reversed.
They changed him. But in the same way, he understood that he was destroying their life, that he was beginning a process which was going to lead to the destruction of their culture.
I believe the Eskimo who live absolutely isolated from civilization are the happiest, healthiest, and most honorable. My sincerest wish is that civilization may never reach them.
Amundsen had stayed long enough to learn the vital survival skills he'd craved. Now all that remained was to complete the final stretch of the passage.
The shoals run across here.
How far?
5 miles to the east and the west.
As the pack ice began to break up with the spring thaw, Amundsen sent several men overland to scout the route ahead. They reported a dangerous channel of shoals and drifting ice to the south of the island.
So you're going through the middle?
But they also said that just 90 miles away lay a well-charted waterway that led to the open sea. If this route remained navigable, the passage was as good as won. On August 13, 1905, the men set sail from Joahaven and headed down the strait that at one point narrowed to just 9 miles.
We call it Simpson Strait now, and it's a very, very narrow channel, and it's very, very shallow, and there's rocks sticking up all over the place. It's an area that modern ships just totally avoid. For Amundsen to navigate through this channel, it was going one way or another, around rocks, around shallow areas, with very, very little room to maneuver. This is dangerous. This is dangerous work.
Hold course!
The thought that here, in these troublesome waters, we risked spoiling everything was anything but pleasant. I couldn't get rid of the thought of returning home having failed. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat.
Boss! Boss! Vessel in sight! Vessel in sight!
On the morning of the 26th of August, 1905, Amundsen had finally gone below to sleep when the crew sighted a vessel ahead and summoned him. It was a whaler, and she was flying the Stars and Stripes. On her hull were painted the words, San Francisco.
The Northwest Passage was done. My boyhood dream was accomplished.
The American commander's greeting was simple. You must be Captain Amundsen. Congratulations.
Roald Amundsen, as a young boy, is reading about Franklin. And he is saying to himself, I'm going to do this, where he failed, where his men died. And I'm going to make it.
For 400 years, the search for a Northwest Passage destroyed ships and claimed the lives of hundreds of men. Amundsen at last had found a route through the Arctic ice pack. But nothing is permanent in the polar region. Today, a century later, a new force of change is at work in the passage, one that neither Amundsen nor Franklin could have foreseen. In the last 30 years, global warming has dramatically thinned the Arctic ice by as much as 30%. This is what rising temperatures did to one Canadian glacier in less than a decade. Many scientists consider such evidence a stark warning of great changes that will take place globally if temperatures continue to increase. Researchers now predict that in 50 years' time, the Arctic will be completely clear of ice in the summer. If that happens, the Northwest Passage could become passable. But nevertheless, there is a stark warning for any sailors contemplating a journey into the heart of the ice maze.
There's no infrastructure available to support those ships yet. No aids to navigation, no search and rescue capability. And the gradually reducing ice that we talk about is not a nice, smooth thing. It's very dynamic, but there's still going to be those difficult ice years, and there's going to be lots of them. It's just that more and more frequently will be the years when there is less and less ice. And that's the real danger for Arctic shipping, is that this illusion of an open Arctic channel will attract people who are unprepared perhaps, to go into the Arctic with ships that are not capable, times of the year when it can be dangerous to do so.
For the Inuit, increased shipping through their territory will bring even more change to their culture. A process that Amundsen helped set in motion and which accelerated during the century that followed his triumph.
You know, education system came. The Hudson's Bay Company came to trade with the Inuit, no matter who they were. They all changed the Inuit way of life.
The Canadian government claimed sovereignty over King William Island and eventually built a settlement for the Inuit at Joahaven, ending thousands of years of a nomadic lifestyle. As for the man who proved the passage was passable, Amundsen went on to become an even more renowned explorer. In 1908, he set his sights on the last great prize of polar exploration, the South Pole. The British had taken the lead in the race to be the first, but once again their approach was flawed. Explorers Robert Scott and Ernest Shackleton had each gotten close, in Shackleton's case to within 100 miles of the goal. But both had been defeated, partly because they'd relied on ill-suited techniques. Above all, hauling sledges laden with thousands of pounds of gear. Amundsen, on the other hand, applied the lessons he'd learned from Nansen and the Inuit. On October 21, 1911, with a small contingent of men, using skis and dogs to haul a minimum of equipment, he set out. And 55 days later, on the 14th of December, he became the first human being to reach the South Pole. 5 weeks later, Robert Scott matched Amundsen's feat, but he and 4 others died of exhaustion and hunger on the way back. Beyond Amundsen's unrivaled success as a polar explorer, he led a quiet life. He never married. He lived alone in Norway in a house filled with Arctic mementos.
He's the biggest man in the world, a kind of an emperor of the Arctic and the Antarctic. Totally famous, but also totally alone. Feeling the coldness, the hunger, always the same men around you, make a strong impression. The ice had its price. Man is going to win over nature, but nature is also going to win over man. The ice and the snow are going inside.
Nearly 20 years after sailing the passage, at age 55, Amundsen set out to help in the rescue of an airship missing in the Arctic. His plane vanished without a trace. He spent his final hours in the place his heart had called home since boyhood.